Díomh agus fáilte arás to the Crazy House Prices podcast with me, Ciarán Mulqueen. Today I am talking with Lorcan Sirr, who is Senior Housing Lecturer in TUD. And we're going to chat a little bit about his article in the Irish Times recently, which goes through the statistics and the number of homes that actually become available for sale, whether it's apartments or houses. And just a bit of a spoiler alert, it's only around 4% of what was built in Dublin City was actually available for people to buy. The rest was built to rent and the rest was social. So it's a reason why, and the main reason why, house prices keep going up where they are. I just went through the figures for the last 6 months for all homes, not just new homes, but in Dublin the median price was €508,000 for buying a house, and nationwide, excluding Dublin, was €318,000. So prices are just going through the roof, as you all know. If you're listening to this, you're well aware of that. So it's a really good chat with Lorcan. We talk about everything from housing policy, apartment building, house building, why we can't build anything, why everything's so expensive. We even talk a little bit about lobbyists, log cabins and all of that. So it's a really good chat, and let's get into it. Now, Lorcan Sirr, welcome back onto the Crazy House Prices podcast. Thanks for taking the time out today. You have a really good article in the Irish Times today about numbers and figures in terms of Dublin City, and there's a little bit about Cork there as well in terms of who's buying what. Would you be able to talk us through that a little bit?
Sure. Yeah, good to be on with you again, Ciarán. So what I went to do, right, so I'm always curious because the government are always saying, like, we built 30,000 houses, or we built whatever, 33,000 houses, or whatever it is every year, and they're kind of boasting about that. And that's all grand. But like, the devil is in the detail with loads of things. So I'm really interested in, of all those houses that we build every year, how many of them, appear for sale for, first-time buyers or movers or anybody, right? All these new houses. And back in about 2017, about half of all the houses that we built became available for sale. So in other words, they appeared in your local estate agent window, right? And you could go down and put a deposit on it and buy a new house. That was in 2017, so not that long ago, 8 years ago. Now that's down to, last year it was 33%. The year before it was 28%. And it's only 33%. It only rose last year because apartments went down. So what remained became a greater proportion of the total output, if you know what I mean. So there's very little, like there's less than 1 in 3 of all new houses are appearing for sale. So where are the rest of them is the obvious question. And the rest of them are made up of like one-off houses. So that's typically rural housing, people building a house for themselves. So they're building a house for themselves. So it's never going to go to an estate agent to be sold. So you'll never see it in the estate agent window. That's fine. That's always in around 18, 19, 20% of houses. And then the rest of them are social housing. So council housing and approved housing body houses. And then there's investors, people, basically landlords, corporate landlords or small landlords buying up housing. And what has happened over the years is that as the numbers of the councils and approved housing bodies, as they bought more housing and the investors bought more housing, the amount available, the remainder available for ordinary people to go out and buy has shrunk a huge, a huge amount, so there's less and less out there. So that's all very well. So then I'm kind of looking at, in the big cities, how many have been available to kind of buy, because the big cities is where the house price action is, So I went and I looked at, say, Dublin, and I discovered if you look at the 4 local authorities of Dublin, so Dunleary, Rathdown, South Dublin, Fingal and Dublin City, what you find last year, we built about 11,000, just under 11,000 new houses were built. That's great. The problem is that out of all those, the apartments that were built there, only 8% of them were sold, and only just over half of all what they call scheme houses, basically estate houses, were sold. So the rest of it all went to investors and to councils and approved housing bodies. In Dublin City, right, for the last 3 years in Dublin City, 95% of all new housing has been apartments. And of course, 95% of that is for rent, right? Either for social renting, council renting, or for investments for the large funds. So out of the 3,350 new houses and homes, we call them, built in Dublin City last year, 111 apartments were sold. That's it. So there's over 3,000 apartments built, 3,100 something, right? And only 111 of those were sold, right? And out of all the houses that were built, 44 houses were sold in Dublin City last year, right? You get out to Cork. And
so hold on, just stop there. So of all the houses, I'll say homes to include apartments and houses. So of all the homes built, only around about, of 3,000, over 3,350 in Dublin City, only around 150 were bought by 155 people.
Yeah. So out of the 3,350,
4%.
Yeah. Out of the 3,350 new homes in Dublin City last year, 155 were sold to households, right? which is a kind of like 4% or even less, maybe. Yeah, a tiny proportion of all the new housing, right? Which is not great if you're from Dublin and want to stay near your family or where you work or all that kind of stuff. You go to Cork, right? In Cork last year, Cork City, they built 313 new apartments. Of those 313, 9 were sold to households. Right, it gets worse. If you stay in Cork City, they built 856 new estate houses, right? Scheme houses, they're called by the CSO. We call them, typical, like loads of people in Ireland, like myself, grew up in housing estates. So estate houses. So out of the 856, 44 were sold to households, right? It's absolutely like scandalously low amounts of numbers. So because the houses are being snapped up by everybody else, the state and everybody else. And state isn't competing. Like you have approved housing bodies competing with the Land Development Agency, competing with the council to buy these kind of houses, and they're paying, through the nose of them. And of course, because there's so little housing coming to the market, the prices are beginning to rocket, right? So across County Dublin, like the 4 local authorities, the kind of median price for a new house paid last year was €475,000, right? Which is nearly $500,000. It's quite a lot. And for anybody moving house, they paid 600,000. But we just focus on the new housing. And in Dublin City, then what you have is the median price of a new home bought in Dublin City, right? So median is kind of like the average, not quite the average, but the median was €850,000 for a new home in Dublin City, right? And that was 630,000 if you bought a new house. So that's probably what you're going to have paid last year. And €875,000 if you bought one of those 111 new apartments that came for sale in Dublin City last year.
So the apartments were so people are paying 800 grand for an apartment.
€875,000 for a new apartment. So only 111 were sold, but the median price was 811. So if you take that 875, right, last year, in 2017, the equivalent price in Dublin City was 420. So they've more than doubled in 8 years, right? And the 630 for a house last year in Dublin City in 2017, that was 369,000. So despite output rocketing or, going up, prices are also going up hugely and really fast. So that's it. Like all the economists will tell you, if supply goes up, price will come down. Of course, that doesn't work. So
only if you can buy them.
Yeah, well, they have to be there, exactly. Yeah, so they're not there, and that's the crux of it. Like 9 out of 10 new apartments that we build don't come available for people who listen to this podcast. They don't come available for those people to be able to buy. And yes, like for me, the really disconcerting thing, given all those figures, right, is that the government, like Simon Harris last week and Micheál Martin this week, both saying, "Oh, we need the private sector, and the focus has to be on apartments." And you're kind of going, "Hang on a second, why? They don't come for sale. Are you here to govern to make policy for investors, or are you here to make policy for Irish households?" And it seems to me it's very much geared towards investors and not towards households. And then the other thing to do, of course, is reduce the standards. And now you can have buildings full of one beds, and there's a whole move to remove balconies off most of them, all that kind of petty nonsense that doesn't really save a whole lot. So the only options are small apartments, reduced standards for rent, right? That's the only options in these last area in these areas. So what happens then, of course, is that people aren't stupid. They know they can't bring up a family in these small apartments. So you look around, Kieran, right, and you see all these new apartment blocks, and what do you see on the balconies? Bikes, clothes drying, all that kind of stuff, right? Kids' toys, which would suggest to me that the size and the way the apartments are fitted out already are not suitable, right? They're already inadequate, and yet we're determined
to make
them.
Like in Europe, in a normal apartment block in Europe, whether it was built 100 years ago or whether it's recently built, they have like those storage units underground. Everybody has like kind of like their own little shed, because I've been in them because my in-laws lived all around Europe, and you just see the difference in storage, the difference in build. They're vastly different to apartments that are built here.
Well, I used to live in Sweden, right? So the apartment block I lived in Stockholm was 4 stories high, and on the ground floor lived a retired soldier, and he was still only like 50, right? And he lived there kind of cheap rent, but he looked after the place. He took in parcels and posts and looked after. And in the basement then was a thing called a Tvättstugan, which was basically a laundrette with kind of say 3 commercial washers or 2 commercial washers and 2 dryers, and you put a pin in the board and say Lorcan Sirr was 6 to 8 on a Thursday evening or whatever it was, right? And if you hadn't got your washing taken out by 8 o'clock, they'd do it for you, that kind of stuff. stuff. But also you had these cages, which are maybe 2 meters by 2 meters. And that was for your child's buggy, your skis, and of course in Sweden, your winter tires, your summer tires, whatever, all the crap you can't have in the apartment. We do none of that, and we're determined to make this apartment. So what we're doing is we're making them smaller. So we're making them, but you'll get more rent per square meter, but we're actually making them less. So Orla Hegarty on RT Brainstorm there this week did a good piece, and she has analysed like what you'll get with these new regulations. You'll actually house fewer people in a block, but you'll get much more rent, and that's what it seems to be all about for the government.
So just to recap there, so basically the government policy is focusing almost entirely on getting the private sector to build apartments, which 95% of which won't come for sale. So it has to be built to rent. So the biggest player then, is the biggest player in the housing market now the state, or is it the build to rent investors? Because we're told that, the build to rent stuff is slowing down because it's not profitable enough for them somehow. But so who's the biggest player at the moment?
The state.
It's not you or I.
No, it's the state is in various guises is taking up about a quarter of the housing stock, right? Now, interestingly enough, when you say that it's not, as I say, viable, I wish I'd stop using the word viable, right? Profitable is the word that viability is kind of like a Slovene word for profitability, So it's about profitability. But really, what happened is the state is the biggest player. They're taking up about a quarter of all new housing, but a lot of the housing they're taking up is bought from people who have land with planning permission for apartment blocks and now have nobody to buy them if they do build them. So there's nobody there to buy them, so the banks won't fund them then to get built. So the state is stepping in and saying we will guarantee to buy them at the end of the process, and they're giving them a letter. The developer runs off to AIB or the bank and says, look, the council are going to buy them all, and so therefore the bank will fund them because they have a guaranteed buyer at the end, which is the state, blue chip, purchaser. Or else the state will fund the development themselves, and the builder will build them out for them, or the developer will build them out for them. Either way, the state is the big player there. So even though there's no market for the guys who are doing it for the private rental sector, for the big investors, they've now found a market in the state. And you think that because the state was the only market there, they'd be getting great value, right? Because they're the only game in town, but they're not getting great value at all. John McCartney, who used to be head of research in Savills and then BNP Paribas, and now he's a lecturer with us in TU Dublin, he wrote a great piece in the Irish Times recently about this very fact that, if the state is such a big player, it should be getting really, really good value. And it's not. So the other kind of kick in the teeth about all this is that state, like as in us, is paying through the nose for all these things. At the same time, it's kind of bailing out a lot of guys who made bad financial decisions.
But we know historically that we're not very, the state, not we, but the state is not very good at getting value for money for anything. And I'm not going to go down the whole bike shed route, but it's a very, I think with the children's hospital and all that, we know that's how they operate because they've proven it. So if government policy then is focusing more on apartments and we're not getting anything newly built, like you might argue with the state building social, like obviously we need more than that with the homeless figures the way they are, but we also need things to be built that people can buy, and the bigger developers aren't going to do that because there's more money in it for them to build to rent. So is there something we can do there, or something we can look towards where we go back to the way we used to do things, and we'd have maybe smaller builders if we could find them, but smaller builders to maybe start building more houses that people could buy?
Well, okay, just go back for a second to the value for money thing, right? It's really interesting. I'm nearly finished writing a book, and I'm going back, starting in 1720, and I'm writing about the first maps of Ireland and the first Griffith valuations, and also the workhouses, right? The workhouses from around the country, right? Back in the day, there was huge ructions with workhouses, so they brought in an English architect called George Wilkinson to design and build all these workshops, workhouses, which he did, and there was huge complaints over the cost of them, right? So then the solution was to reduce extraneous detail on the buildings. Like, this is exactly the same as now, right? The floors, they cost a lot of money. If you think balconies, right? In those days, they're talking about the floors. So take out the timber floors and let them sleep on the dirt, right? It was exactly the same thing. Cost overruns, delays, liability, defects, insurance, exactly the same in 1838 as it is in 2024, right? So the Built Children's Hospital, bike sheds, all that stuff, there is nothing new under the sun in all this, right? We have a history of this kind of crack, So back to what we can do ourselves. I think we've put all our eggs in huge developers, right, who can build huge apartment blocks, okay? The vast majority of small, medium-sized building companies in Ireland, they build houses. They have no experience in building 4, 5, 6, 10-story apartment blocks. So therefore, they'll never get funding for it, because they go to the bank and the bank will say, have you ever built, 6 stories before? And they go, no, because I build houses and housing estates. So they won't get funding. So we've sidelined hundreds of SME building companies in the country by focusing on these large apartments. And we've also confused this concept of density. Oh, it's all about density. Density doesn't have to be high rise. Like you go to the Netherlands, right? If you draw a line from Dublin to Galway, everything south of that is the size of the Netherlands, right? We have 5.2 million population. They have 17.5 million people, right? They've got 3.5 times our population living in half the land. Do they build high? Not really. They build dense. They build density. They build housing that's 3 stories, and they mightn't have a front garden, but they build lots of this parking and the space for kids and parks and all that stuff. But they do density really well. We've insisted that it can only be apartments, and therefore we've excluded hundreds of SME building companies. So the solution really is, back to what we used to do really well, and it doesn't necessarily have to be sprawling housing estates, but using SME builders to fill in all those small sites that large builders won't go near. Exactly, all around the rural towns around the country, your Clonmel's, your Tipperary's, your Sligo's, all those places. There are loads of sites there, and there's no funding for builders, like for SME builders, to get at, so that they can go in and develop like medium density housing in those areas. And the Housing Finance Agency, which is a state body that was set up to lend to builders, like it lends at exactly the same rate as a bank, like 9 and 10%. So where's the advantage there for anybody? So we're kind of shooting ourselves in the foot at every turn. So a lot of, I'm increasingly convinced, Kieran, that a lot of the problems that we have are self-inflicted.
Yeah. You're probably overpaying for your mortgage protection. Now, I'm not, because I use Beat the Bank and I've been dealing with them for years. They're an Irish company, and in a world where most companies in the home buying process are out for themselves, it's refreshing to have one that genuinely cares about you. As cliche as that sounds, but they really do. So how they work is they check the main insurers, they match the best price, and then they take more off. It's quick, it's online, and they handle all the paperwork. They also do income protection, life insurance, and soon they'll be doing home insurance, car insurance, even pet insurance. So www.beatthebank.ie to get a quote in seconds. So if they can't get the financing for it then, and those sites are then left undeveloped, what happens then? How can we go around it? Is there an argument there for cheaper funding? What about co-ops? Like I was looking at that with the Denmark thing, because I'm doing a podcast at the moment. I'm trying to come up with solutions and the Vienna model and all that stuff that we hear about, the Kenny report from whatever 1975. So like, what's the solution there to any of those sites that are there? Or should we be looking at, could we fund those builders, those smaller builders, for tackling, I don't know, vacant and derelict homes with the 100 odd thousand of those lying around?
Yeah, it's all that. You know what I mean? There's like the government seem to have only one strategy, which is build lots of apartments, and unfortunately they're all for rent. And that seems to be the only idea they have, because it's a very industry friendly idea. It suits industry because they can make loads of money of it, and then the industry come crying cap in hands, it's not viable, i.e. profitable to do that, and of course it is. So therefore they reduce standards even more, and they have cheerleaders out there in the so-called housing experts who say that we need to make smaller units and remove the balconies and all that kind of nonsense. So they put all the eggs in those baskets, but they don't deliver what Irish people need, what your normal households need. So it's all that kind of stuff. It's lending at preferable rates. Now they're terrified to do that because they say, it's anti-competitive. European legislation says you can't compete with the market. Well, other countries do it, so I don't know why we can't do it. There's loads of Vienna City Council lends to private developers at preferential rates. There's loads of places that do that. But it's also incentivizing small infill sites, vacancy, dereliction, using the tax system to free up existing housing as well. So you read a lot about downsizing. Right now, I don't read the concept of downsizing, because in my mind, there's a kind of a nudge, like a really insidious kind of nudge thing you read in the paper all the time. But if you're an older person and you're sitting in your big house on your own, and you feel guilty because I'm living in this big house on my own, I shouldn't be, I should give it up for a young couple or whatever. But downsizing is a rich person's game. Like, you need to have money, because there's no bridging finance so you can buy an apartment at the same time before you sell your house, etc., etc. You need to be able to have the cash there to buy your apartment and then sell your house. Right? So you need to be wealthy to do that. We could use the tax system and stamp duty to make that more viable for people to do. To make it more feasible for people if they want to downsize. And if they don't want to, I think that's their business, to be honest with you. Nobody should tell anybody what they can do or can't do.
But also,
inside their home, But
where are they going to downsize to? There's nothing for them to buy. That's the problem.
Well, next you have €875,000 last year in Dublin. Who's going to buy a 2-bedroom apartment? You know what I mean? That's exactly it. So then they end up moving farther away from their communities and where they go to bingo and whatever they do. So they're not going to do that.
But they don't. So they just don't sell. Yeah.
Of course. And why would they? You got to think about it logically. Like, why would? And also, there's a lot of houses that look on paper like a lot of the ideas come out of here. It's just from analysing spreadsheets. No concept of how the real world works. So somebody would say, there's a lot of older people living in houses that are too big for their needs, or like 5 bedrooms and there's only 2 of them in the house. They have no idea. So I have lots of friends whose parents live on their own in the house. But at the weekend, the whole family descends on the house with all the kids and grandkids and blah, blah, blah. And there's mayhem and chaos for a few days, right? And then the kids all go back to their own house for the weekend. The parents are on their own in the house. And you can have hobbies. You might have an erg machine downstairs in one of the, or upstairs in one of the bedrooms. You might have at a home office, whatever. So I don't like this idea that, like, on paper it says there's too many people like living in houses that are too big for the needs. I think it's, nobody knows what people's needs are, So it's classic spreadsheet analysis. And you get this kind of crack as well with also with a lot of the ideas around that people look at spreadsheet, but they don't actually understand how it works.
So is this where maybe the lobbyists are writing this policy again towards trying to maybe push these people into log cabins in their gardens and let their families move into their house? Like, is this where we're going with this whole log cabin planning permission thing?
Well, that's another idea, right? That comes from spreadsheet. It's not a new idea either. None of the ideas that I have seen in recent years are new at all. But it's this idea that there's so much space in the city. If you divide it by 45 square meters, we could fit X amounts of sheds in people's back gardens that they can live in. The real world doesn't work like that for lots of reasons. Like, there's lots of reasons why you wouldn't want to do that. For a start, the likes of Irish Water and Uisce Éireann wouldn't want it at all, because you end up with back gardens being concreted over, right? So you end up with all these concrete platforms and back gardens, and then you end up like, one thing Irish Water really like is people having gardens. Okay, now I was bad boy a few years ago. I took out my front garden and put in concrete for a driveway, right? That is the wrong thing to do if you're listening to this, right? You need lots of glass because our drainage system is already suffering, Victorian drainage system that we have. So Irish Water, the last thing they want to see is a proliferation of concrete over back gardens and water running into the drains, and then you have floods everywhere, right? Then there's the whole idea, a lot of them will turn into illegal rents without a doubt, and that's the evidence that has been around the world. And the RTB won't get any extra funding to regulate this or to control this. You will have elder abuse, whereby parents are getting not so subtly nudged to move into the back garden in their own house and let their kids live in the main house. And then you'll have mayhem with things like, people move into a shed into your neighbour's back garden, and there's no planning permission needed for it, and they'll bring along a second car, right? So now you're on a street, looking at my own street here, now you're on a street and you have like 30% more cars being parked everywhere. Mayhem. Then rows between neighbours and all this kind of stuff. And then the council don't even know how many people are. So these kind of ideas, to me, to be honest with you, are really simplistic, and we know that they don't really contribute anything, but they do have bad outcomes.
Very well said. And I think people often forget about that, the drainage thing. Like, I'm getting my driveway done next week, and that was part of my thinking, was because at the moment my driveway is pure concrete, and we're getting that all dug up and putting the stabilization grids in, putting the stones out, so that there is drainage there, and that it holds a bit of water and then it drains out slowly. It's the way it should be done. And then the grass in the back garden. Don't get me started on AstroTurf as well. I've a hatred of that. But
that's what I should have done, and that's what people should do, right? So Kieran is talking sense here. Like, the last thing, like, we don't need to go over the water issue, right? But our sewage system is Victorian, right? And it's crumbling at the seams, and Ringsend is full, and all that kind of stuff. Like, the last thing Irish Water want to see, and Dublin Corp, Dublin City Council want to see, is more water going into the drainage system. Like, that's not what we want. That's not, and that's like, you're going to need concrete raft foundations for all these things.
I was looking, because I'm beside Mead Street here. Mead Street's been getting dug up for the last quite a few months, and you can see all the old water pipes out because they've removed them, and they have them on the road, and then they're putting this big, huge blue, brand new plastic pipe that's going in. They've been doing it for a long time. I'd say the businesses are losing their mind, but when you actually see the old pipes, it's like you could nearly pull it apart with your hands. They're completely crumbling, which is,
and God only knows what they're leaking into the water as well. Like,
exactly,
that's the other thing, And they're full of holes, and our leakage rate is huge. We lose, I can't remember, I wrote something on it earlier on this year, and I can't remember, is it 25 to 40%? We lose a huge amount of water too, because of these old pipes. So we need to be really careful how we manage our water. Putting concrete in over back gardens everywhere is not the cleverest idea at all.
So anyone listening to this is probably getting annoyed now as well, because it's not looking good in terms of prices. So what is it? What would you suggest? What can people do? Can we give them anything that they can go off and maybe speak to their local representatives about, or their family and friends, or whatever? What can people actually do to try and improve things?
Yeah, well, the interesting thing, like, what families are doing, and I see it, and I hate this when I do the radio, I do podcasts, like, I'm like, this kind of, it's very negative, and I don't mean to be negative, but these are just the data and the facts, like, And what you see is that what people are doing, and like younger people in particular, like it was the case a few years ago that the greatest house price inflation was all around Dublin, like so Meath, Louth, Wicklow, and Kildare, right? Then that moved into Longford and Roscommon, right? And now that's moved up to the border region. So the border region house prices went up by 11% last year, which is the highest proportion in any region in the country. So people are moving farther and farther away. I don't know what the government, approaching your TDs and approaching that, like TDs have very little power in my experience, and they're kind of told what to do by party whips and follow the party leader's line on this. So you'd wonder how effective it is. But like ultimately, and I said this this morning on the radio, and I kind of I've very little I'm running out of patience with this kind of stuff. But really, the people to blame it isn't industry capacity. It's not COVID. It's not the great economic unpleasantness in 2007, 2008. It's none of that. The people to blame are ministers, the current minister and his successors, his special advisors, and the civil servants the relevant civil servants who are involved in this. Right? They are the only three people that I blame for the chaos. They have huge powers given to them to change policy and to change legislation. So therefore, they have huge responsibility for the outcomes, right? And they're the people I find, and it's very hard to get to them. I was at a thing recently down in New Ross, in summer school in New Ross. No politician would come up at all to talk about housing on stage in front of like the minister's local audience. No politician at all. So it's hard to get through to them. I don't know what makes them tick or what can move the dial, as they say on Newstalk. I don't know what can happen that will change their thinking unless there's actual like on the street protests. And even we had that with Raise the Roof, and the unions organising that, and I'm not sure how successful that was. You get tens of thousands of people out, but you don't see Micheál Martin or Simon Harris, who have moved hugely to the right, particularly Fianna Fáil. Like Fianna Fáil used to be the party of house builders, and that's what they were known for good or bad, right? It wasn't all good, that connection. And now they're just a party of like quite a neoliberal party in many ways. Like they might be socially left, as in we had abortion referendum, and we had same-sex marriage, all that kind of stuff. But the country may be socially left, but the main political parties, and you'd always expect it of Fine Gael, but Fianna Fáil have moved to occupy a huge space in the trail of Fine Gael, like as quite a right-wing neoliberal party. Like the emphasis is always on the market. So that's why we have water problems, right? Because the state always felt that the market would solve our problems, and I've no doubt that they intended to sell off Irish Water, and some British company would come in and fix all the pipes, charging us at the same time for our water through that. And I've known, like, so the whole ideology has been one of the state should spend as little as possible, and the private sector will take care of it. And that has never worked, really. What you end up with is outcomes that the private sector wants, but that don't suit society. And you see that in the UK, huge water bills at the same time as the CEOs are taking multi-million pound packages home. People are getting crucified with water bills and leaks everywhere, and dirty water in the taps and all that stuff. So you see that lack of investment. So it's really hard to get through to kind of policymakers and politicians that this just isn't working for people.
And just people, one might argue as well, for the odd left wing thing they did, like in terms of marriage referendums and the abortion referendum, all that was actually activists on the ground that kind of forced their hand into that. I think they were begrudgingly pushed towards those. But I guess a good place to leave it would be even just people having conversations with each other, with their family, with whoever, and then the more people that are getting a bit more annoyed about this, because ultimately it's going to come down to votes, isn't it? And
well, it's interesting. Yeah, no, it's just back on the policy thing when I think about it. Like, it's interesting. I got a few emails this morning over that article with the Irish Times, and they were definitely from leafy South County Dublin, suburbs, who would probably be old school Fine Gael voters, right? And they were giving out as well about all the apartments going up and nothing for them to buy, or their kids to buy, or downsize to, or all that kind of stuff. And I have mates. I'm at the age now where I have mates who are quite successful. They've done well over the years, and wealthy people tend to vote right? So they'd all be Fine Gael voters. I know they are, and we laugh about it, right? And I say that's your affliction now, and they go, well, it's just grand, and that's what to do. But even they are coming around and saying, "Jesus, look, nothing is working here." So when you have the party faithful, like, and the loyalists saying this isn't working, it's funny that they haven't picked up on that on the ground. You know what I mean? The actual party organisations themselves, Fianna Fáil and Fine Gael, haven't picked up on it. Like this, like people are just not happy with this.
Yeah, and I guess what's the alternative? that's the thing they'll always say. Then, if they're not voting for those established parties, what's the alternative?
But even if you do, so what you notice over the last years, like we have a kind of benign dictatorship for since about the 1990s. Like even if you don't vote for one, like the two of them end up getting it together anyway. You know what I mean? So it's very hard to do it. The only thing you can do is try and if they had lost a few high profile seats, I think that would probably help. You know what I mean? If you had a minister lose a seat, a minister for housing, for example, lose a seat, that would probably send a signal. I mean, I think one of the biggest problems is the ease of access that lobbyists get to the policymakers and the ministers. You don't see me or you getting invited in too often, Karen. Maybe you do, but get invited into the customers too often to give your ideas about, you know.
I won't be after this podcast anyway.
Yeah. So, you know, but yet if you're a lobbyist, like, you know, and particularly if you're an ex-politician, right, you can just walk into Leinster House for the rest of your life, even though you're a lobbyist, and that's totally inequitable. It's unfair. I think it's anti-democratic. And so one of the things I would love to see is just a ban on lobbying for 12 or 18 months and then see how policy changes.
Yeah, and that's maybe where we could come in, and you lobby your local politicians.
But you're a powerful voice. Like these kind of podcasts are very powerful voices. You know what I mean? Because you have a particular audience, which is quite, you know, it's at that you're hitting the demographic, which is a really important demographic, who are going to feel it most. You know, we're at the stage now when you're 36, it's the average age to get married, have your first baby, and buy your first house. Right, a very busy year, right, for people. But that's the average age. You know, and that's a crucial age. They're politically savvy. They're aware. I mean, if they can be motivated to go out and vote, well, that's probably where it's at.
Brilliant. That's probably a good place to leave it. Thanks so much as insightful as always, Lorcan. I really appreciate it.
You're welcome, Kieran. No, pleasure as always.
Agus Shinné Lahai on episode shut of the Crazy House Prices podcast. If you enjoyed this episode, please share it with a friend, tag me on Instagram, leave a quick review. Don't forget my Patreon for bonus Q&As and all of that stuff. So it's patreon.com/Crazy House Prices. You can even comment on these episodes now on Spotify. Again, massive thank you to Lorcan for coming on and giving us such valuable insights. He's so good at this stuff and he's very on top of everything that's going on. And as depressing as these episodes can be, it's just always good to have something to work on there, something for people to take away, where whether it's making them more angry and giving them a bit of a motivation to try and do something about this. Any little bit helps in that kind of things. But anyway, thanks so much for listening. I'll chat to you all soon. Slán go fóill.